Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Common prosperity, the catchword in a recent high-level meeting chaired by Chinese President Xi Jinping. Participants discussed plans to achieve that goal along with financial stability and development strategies. The meeting resulted in a decision that China will stick to a people-centered development path while balancing the relationship between efficiency and fairness. There was also going to be the pledge to strengthen market-based principles and law-based governance, along with efforts to prevent major financial crises. So what does common prosperity really mean, and how does China plan to achieve it? Let's ask our panelists. For more on this, joining us in Washington, D.C., Yukong Huang, Senior Associate in the Carnegie Asia Program. In Singapore, Professor Bert Hoffman, Director of the East Asian Institute at National University of Singapore. Former World Bank Country Director for China, Korea, and Mongolia. In Shanghai, Wang Dan, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank. And in Shenzhen, last but not least, Xiao Geng, Director of the Institute of Policy and Practice of Shenzhen Finance Institute from Chinese University of Hong Kong. Wonderful to see every one of you, ladies and gentlemen. This is an important topic. Well, a lot of things are going on in the world. China is focusing on equality. So I think that's a common prosperity, the catchword is. How do you see the emphasis on this word? Mr. Xiao.
Well, I think China in the last 40 years has to, go to the market economy and opening up. So a lot of people get rich, and the economy also, grows in scale. And a lot of things are really doing well, but one thing common to every other country is the inequality. So this is the right time, to really focus on how to solve the common problem for every country. And I think China set the target many years ago, but now really start to implement it.
Ms. Wang, do you see it that way from the financial service sector?
Well, I think in practical terms, it means equal access to financial services, to education and healthcare. And right now, it seems that the biggest problem is that though on average, everyone's income and wealth is improving, rich people's income and wealth is accumulating a lot faster than low-income people. So how do we really increase the income for the lowest bracket, the 20%, or the lowest 20% is the biggest challenge.
So it seems that to both of you, it is an important message. The question is how. Mr. Huang, do you see it that way?
I think it's certainly a key question that policymakers in China need to address at this moment in time. When I look at China's experience over the last 20, 30 years, I'm struck by two particular statistics. One is that personal incomes have increased by about 10% a year, every year for decades. So everyone's gotten a lot better off, and that's extraordinary. At the same time, the measurements of inequality have soared. So inequality has soared. So this particular moment in time, the question is, can you maintain rapid growth so that everyone's lives are better, and at the same time moderate growing inequality? And I think there's ways of doing that. But I would stress that the concept of equality has many aspects. I would say that most societies, what's really important is equality of opportunities. And that's what you have seen in China over the last several decades. People have found jobs, they moved around, they've gone in different activities. As a consequence, incomes have soared. So it's also very important to keep in mind that we're not just thinking about equality of outcomes, but equality of opportunities to join what I call a more prosperous society.
Means and results. Professor Hoffman, what about for you, that catchword?
On the positive side, China's inequality has actually, income inequality has actually come down. Ever since 2011, when it peaked, it came down. In the national statistics, it came down a little bit from the Gini coefficient, a measure for inequality. It came down from 48 to 45. What is still rising is wealth inequality. And I think that is in part the concern that happens in the West. There's a lot of talk about wealth inequality. And during the COVID crisis, even the wealthier people became more wealthier because their shares got up in price. China is like any country, has a higher inequality in wealth than in income. The Gini coefficient for wealth is about 70, but it's not as unequal as, say, the United States or even my country, the Netherlands, where it is 90. It's comparable to a bit higher than Korea and Japan. Clearly, there are concerns with inequality, and one of the concerns is that rich people have more influence on policy making and then make policies that continue to be good for rich people. So Deng Xiaoping saying people may get rich first and then need to help others to get rich too, I think that's the most concern, and that relates to Professor Huang's note on equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes.
Well, this is one part of it. The other part of the discussion about the latest policy direction is what's going to happen to those who are already become relatively richer than the other parts of the population. For example, the private sector, for example, the tech sector, and many of those individuals that are flourishing over the past decades during the reform and opening up. What kind of process is this likely to be for them? Professor Xiao, I want to knock on your door first about, you're based in Shenzhen. That's where a lot of things are happening. Prosperity, you see that. How do people there read the latest messages?
Well, I think for people in Shenzhen, the key message is that the government is going to spend a lot of resources to help, the housing and also education infrastructure. This is the main message, and in fact, Shenzhen has already started this process, and Shenzhen is actually trying to learn from Singapore and in a way also Hong Kong, to provide the housing to the low-income people. The Shenzhen is really encouraging innovation, and a lot of companies, private companies, they actually emerge in Shenzhen really by planning, So I think here people is commonly, in the sense that they understand the government would continue to keep opening and also keep the market forces.
Professor Hoffman, how do you see the example of Shenzhen and some of the other places, so-called, and also the individuals, that 20% of Chinese population are actually earning more than 10 times than the rest of the population? How do you see this divide, and what does that mean for that 20% also?
I'd like to repeat Yukong Huang's words that actually over the past 10 years, the bottom 40% has gained more than the top 10%. So their incomes are actually rising more rapidly. But in some areas, such as Shenzhen, it becomes very difficult to live because it's so expensive, and people would have to, in a way, have job opportunities elsewhere. Some of the more traditional work that is happening in Shenzhen maybe has to move elsewhere. At the same time, there is a risk that these debates, and they happened in the 60s and the 70s in the West, and frankly, at some point the income taxes and even wealth taxes became so high that it became a clear disincentive for people to work hard. And you saw a lot of capital flight, you saw big entrepreneurs all moving to Monaco. That was the place to go because they had very low income tax. So those are things to take into account into this debate as well.
Ms. Wang.
So I think we need to also realize that reducing inequality and reducing poverty are two different things. And for a lot of the rich people in a wealthier class, many of them are entrepreneurs, and they should be rewarded for the hard work and innovation that they have done. But right now, it just seems that we don't have a mechanism in place that will guarantee equal access, especially to the financial services. And when we look at the post-COVID world, it is the most difficult time for small, medium enterprises, and it's even harder for them to borrow and stay alive. So that is probably the most pressing issue in the next decade.
Professor Huang.
I'd like to make an observation about why it is we see such extreme inequality and why has it been increasing so much more rapidly, let's say, in the last decade or two compared to the past. And in one sense, it's because innovation, entrepreneurial initiatives create a lot more income and wealth more rapidly today than it used to. And that is because we actually have a globalized world. So if you have talent somewhere, whether in the United States or China or in Europe, your market no longer is the local market, it's become global. So the earnings that you accrue become much bigger than they would have been, let's say, 50 years ago. And then in China, you have a special factor. You can actually make or become quite wealthy in China without becoming global, because China's market, internal market, is so large. And that's why you see the rise of so many billionaires in China over the last 10 or 20 years. So if you have a lot of entrepreneurial spirit and you hit the right kinds of activities, your gains are enormous. And then the question is this good or bad? And I would argue that a lot of this is quite good, of course, because it generates jobs, it generates activities, it spurs money to new kinds of investments, and that's good for growth. And China's grown faster because of this. But then you have this inequality. And as Bert Hoffman mentioned, you have a wealth problem. So I think the key issue in terms of this inequality issue is how do you tax or how do you moderate the rapid increase in wealth that accrues to individuals because of entrepreneurial innovative talents. And you don't want to discourage that activity, but you also should we all recognize that some of that is excessive. And society needs to make use of it in a better way. Otherwise, you're going to have what I would call a lot of pressure on on society in general.
Professor Zhao, agree?
Yes, I think this is the key for China. The tax system actually is already very progressive. I think the key is really to focus on how to allow the low-income people, a lot of people who can really have a decent living standards, and so they can really increase their productivity. And I think another important point is that those big companies and entrepreneurs, they already started to voluntarily really to do charity, and also contribute to some development. And this is really good because then you motivate the market forces to solve, the poverty alleviation and also some of the social welfare, issue, which is really a trend globally. And I also want to point out, actually agree with Bert, I looked at the data, actually China's Gini is doing better than the United States. China is actually declining and the US is increasing. So I think this global context is actually quite important because China really now are, in the global village. And how China solves this, inequality problem is really important.
But Professor Xiao, many would argue, if I just quickly follow up, is the U.S. a good place to compare with, given how divided the politics is, how much problem it's having right now, compared to the other economies even? Professor Xiao?
I think yes, because this is the number one, number two economy. And has very different political, social systems, and they are learning from each other in the economy. But on social issues, they really represent two different approaches.
Professor Huang, we see that governments around the world have been working on the huge multilateral companies that are even bigger than some of the national economies in the world. And we see higher taxes, we see more scrutiny of policies, and we also see more scrutiny of the founders and their practices. How do you see the global context of that? And how do you put China in that global context?
We have this is actually a very current issue. in the sense that there's a movement to look at and regulate corporate tax rates globally. You have a problem here. Countries believe that multinational companies, particularly ones which are very profitable, that it should be fairly taxed or taxed at least significantly enough to make a difference in terms of generating wealth for our countries. But if you tax your corporations more than other countries are, then companies move, they relocate. So now you see a global discussion about should there be a minimum global corporate income tax. So I think that's one aspect of the problem, to make sure that corporations pay their relative share. But I think that there's the other aspect, because ultimately that money flows to individuals. Mm-hmm. And when that money flows to individuals, and some have incredible wealth, that becomes a wealth issue. So you have someone like Bill Gates at Microsoft, and what does he think the solution is? Well, he's a great example. He makes a lot of money and he generates a lot of innovation. He also ends up with billions and billions of dollars. And the solution in his particular case, he realizes he's better off giving it away to society. So in the U.S., you're moving to a situation where the concept is make as much money as you can, because that's innovation, entrepreneurship, but somehow you pay it somehow to society, because our tax systems don't do this. So can you voluntarily do this through charitable institutions is actually a big issue in the United States now.
We see measures and policies, Ms. Wang, in the sectors of high-tech platforms, for example, education, as well as healthcare and some of the other sectors in China. The policies have been very intense over the past few weeks, and many people relate what's going on then to the latest discussion about common prosperity. Ms. Wang, do you make that link?
I can see a fundamental link there, because when we talk about China's inequality issues, inequality in the background, especially in education, is the key. And right now, the income growth is still pretty fast. So the lower income graduates, people in that group actually have hope. But the social mobility is going down. And that's similar to the case in the US or even in Europe. And that can eventually become a really serious problem. And I can see that the cracking down of the education platform has caused a lot of unemployment and unhappiness among many of the employees. But that probably is one of the things that a regulator have to do, is eventually to increase social mobility, education is probably the easiest access to start with.
Is that the right way?
I think it is the only way.
Okay. Professor Hoffman.
I think the big driver for equality still comes from the expenditure side, and investment in education, investing in public housing, investing in the health system can be structured to be very equalizing and to give more equality of opportunity. But at the same time, there are specific measures that the government could take and has been debating that would give a more equal burden on the revenue side. The capital gains tax I mentioned. Some in the West talk about wealth taxation, broad wealth taxation. It used to be quite popular in the 70s and 80s. It went a little bit out of fashion, but now people say maybe we should reintroduce that. But there's other ways of having a broader, a much broad-based income tax to finance all the burdens that come to China.
Professor Huang, do you see the latest as minor adjustments of directions in terms of how China's economy is likely to approach and how the distribution system is going to be done? Or this is clear message of an important shift of directions? As you may know, these two are very different.
First of all, let me emphasize that I agree fully with Professor Hoffman's comments about what China is weak at, and its tax and social distribution systems could be strengthened. Focus on wealth taxes or some form of wealth taxes, capital gains, property taxes, assets, could also be looked at. But I think from a Washington perspective, what is really driving the markets and concerns are signals, intentional, unintentional, which suggest government policies are likely to be reining in the activities of major internet companies and innovative companies that generate certain kinds of activities. through equity markets, floating of shares, and other kinds of activities. And it's a bit ambiguous. And some of that signal that comes out is a signal which says too much money is going to those activities, too many people are getting wealthy, and this is not China's interest in the long term. And by the way, this is not an issue particular just to China. There's also concern in the US about the fact that major innovative companies dominate the markets, that they have monopoly earnings, and they need to be strongly regulated. So this is actually a concern, not just in China, but also in the United States, also emerging in Europe. But it's also a signal about the fact that many of what I call the wealth creation is occurring in certain kinds of activities. And the debate then becomes, should we discourage people going into those activities? Should we discourage money to go? Should we discourage our youth from entering into those sectors? And I think that's a very serious issue, because then the question, I don't want to disturb what I call entrepreneurial innovative activities, but you also have bearing in mind the social, what I call the social objectives of a country, that is the development of those activities in the country's interests. That's a big issue.
All right. Professor Xiao?
Well, I actually don't think this is a major shift. I see a lot of continuities. And the major change is really serious implementation. And here, I think there are actually some problems in terms of communication and also the timing, particularly important in the sense that China is a country with very strong central government, and the market forces are not really as strong as other places. So I think for me, I hope this is really a continuation of China's 40 years of reform. It's just the acceleration in terms of the common prosperity.
Okay.
I don't see any major change in the long-term development.
Right. My final question, but it's also an important one. In this process, the goal for common prosperity, how much role will the state have, and how much role will the societies and other sectors have? That's, of course, a very interesting question. On that, I also want to invite your opinions briefly, maybe. We'll leave it to other times also to discuss. Ms. Wang.
So I think the state would play equally important role as a society, because there has to be government guidance and there has to be affordable housing backed by the state. But when it comes to innovation, to increase the income for poor people, it has to be based on a market economy. And the private sector will play a key role.
I see.
So in the end, we have to see it as a dynamic problem.
Professor Hoffman.
Well, look, the experience is that beyond the level of income that China is now, that the state will grow. And there is lots of expenditures to be done. If you just look at the aging problem, what the implications for healthcare and the implications for long-term care and the implications for pension, that would add 7 to 10 percentage point of GDP in public spending over the next 30 years. So just that will drive up the influence of the state. But the question is then, okay, so how do you raise the revenues for that? And how do you continue to have a thriving economy that can actually carry that burden? So my answer would be that you need to continue to reform to get more efficiency out of that economy, and be careful with some of the regulation that might kill the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Professor Xiao.
Yeah, I think the state and the market should complement each other, and they both should grow.
Okay, Professor Huang, last but not least.
Well, I would just make the observation that China is moving from what I call upper middle income country to what I call developed country, high income status. And this particular issue reflects the tensions during that transition. So you're dealing with the fact that for China to continue to grow, it must be more innovative, more entrepreneurial. It can't count upon the policies of the past to grow. At the same time, you have now inequality showing up in incomes and wealth. And that's a reflection of the fact that it's been so successful. So this is the key issue. How does it manage the transition to a more innovative economy, at the same time manage these tensions that relate to inequalities in income and wealth?
Thank you everyone for your wonderful contribution. I learned so much. Really appreciate it. Yu Konghang, Bert Hoffman, Xiao Geng, last but not least, Wang Dan. Really appreciate it.